would appear we're in the midst of a cyber conflict, enemies unknown. First, Sony Studios suffered a massive hack attack. That was followed by threats against the studio and any theater that dared show its feature film, The Interview, which depicts an assassination attempt against North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And now North Korea is experiencing widespread internet outages. So far, there have been no official claims of responsibility, but many suspect the U.S. severed North Korea's internet access in retaliation for the Sony breach. And experts say it wouldn't take much to pull that off.
I'd say any 14-year-old kid in this country could probably pull it off, and any toddler in Germany. It's not hard.
Others speculate a rogue attacker is behind the outage, and some theorize North Korea may have dismantled its own network. Joining me now is Michael Schrage, a cybersecurity advisor and research fellow at MIT's Center for Digital Business. Welcome to Greater Boston.
Hi.
So to begin with, I know that you have concerns about how the president described this, that it was cyber vandalism. But you say it's much more severe than that. What's your concern at this moment?
Well, I think it's important for the president to characterize attacks or conflicts in a useful way and not in ways that minimize our options. In the same way you shouldn't inflate a threat, I don't think one should minimize one either. The idea that this is cyber vandalism, Sony just had its email ransacked and its systems brought down. Well, suppose that was your bank. Suppose that was WGBH. Suppose that was the Internal Revenue Service. So the idea of saying, well, it's just an act of vandalism, it's just a rogue country misbehaving, I think that minimizes it. I think this is a very, very serious breach, and it sets a very dangerous precedent. And I don't think we should call dangerous precedents vandalism. I think we should call them something else.
Well, you just pointed out that it's Sony Pictures. It isn't a bank or other major breach, although certainly there was severity there, too, because a lot of employees had their social security numbers put out there. There was a lot of private information that was out there. But what does this tell us about, could this be possible at a bank? Do they have different infrastructure so that to prevent against a cyber attack, or a government institution?
One would hope that major banks and minor banks are capable of withstanding a state-sponsored cyber threat, a state-sponsored cyber assault. There are no guarantees of that. One would hope that government agencies would be able to withstand cyber assaults like this. I would be less than confident of that. In a perverse sort of way, we may be lucky, and I put that word lucky in single quotes, that it was Sony, because everybody, and I mean everybody, is seriously revisiting how secure their cyber defenses are, not just in terms of defense, by the way, but in terms of reacting or responding to an incursion that could lead to something larger.
Does this have to be a threat by an entity like North Korea? I mean, we're still debating whether it was even North Korea, or whether it was some sort of rogue independent group.
That is what I consider a scholastic, how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin kind of question, because the legal regimes for response are different. A state attacking the United States is a different regime of laws, a different set of laws than a criminal organization doing it. State-sponsored terrorism is different than a state attack on us. So ultimately, and this is a horrible but not uniquely American phenomenon, ultimately the lawyers are going to decide what the legal regimes and appropriate legal responses to these things are. But yes, the issue of attribution is increasingly important, i.e., is it a state responsible? Is it non-state actors responsible? Is it state-supported, non-state actors responsible? Those things are shrouded in ambiguity, and that means the law is shrouded in ambiguity.
Well, I'm also wondering what kind of effort it took. I mean, part of my asking the question was wondering, do you need the major forces of a major government and what they can bring to bear to have a cyber attack like this, or can it be a smaller independent group?
My bet would be that to establish attribution, to establish probable cause or beyond a reasonable doubt, and I say this without being a lawyer, you probably employed some of the three-letter agencies doing forensics, digital forensics and audits of the networks to determine points of origin, what the nature of the attack is. Those are things that an organization, a commercial organization like a Sony or a Bank of America or a Citicorp not only can't do, they wouldn't be legally allowed to do.
Now, how much are corporations like Sony going to have to partner up with the government at this point to ensure that they have some level of protection going forward?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. In the UK, the gentleman who ran GCHQ a couple of years ago convened a quasi-public summit with all of the banks, basically saying the only way British banks will be able to protect themselves will be to be more open with British government and share information. So we know that when an individual institution is attacked, the reality is we're pooling information so we can spot broader patterns. So the issue of public-private cooperation going forward is, let's be blunt, it's already going on. The issue is how transparent is it going to become? Haven't a clue.
All right, Michael Schrage, thank you for your expertise. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, well, this isn't the first time that filmmakers like those behind the interview have waded into dicey international territory. Charlie Chaplin made 2 provocative movies, including 1940's The Great Dictator, that took aim at Hitler. And from the Three Stooges to Donald Duck and Bugs Bunny, we've seen American pop culture parody world affairs. But the outcry over the interview raises larger questions about how the world sees us through our entertainment. A 2007 Pew Research Center survey found that roughly 30% of Europeans viewed American movies, music, and TV negatively, as did 40% of South Koreans and Indonesians. Joining me to talk more about all of this is Martha Baylis, a Boston College professor and expert on how popular culture affects public diplomacy. Welcome.
Thank you.
I mean, this is really fascinating. You have written about this in your book, Through a Screen Darkly. We have no idea how the rest of the world views us. We put out a film like The Interview, which we think starring Seth Rogen and James Franco is a comedy, a satire. But how is the world looking at us when they see films like this?
Well, I think that's a question that has just blown up in our faces with this particular incident. I was looking at the guidelines that were published I was looking at some of the internal documents that were released through the hacking, I confess. And one of them was a series of marketing guidelines for Sony, for this particular release overseas from Sony Pictures. And the first one was try to make Kim Jong-un a kind of sympathetic character, not just a dangerous dictator, but a kind of a guy that, you know, people can relate to. And in American terms, in the terms of our rather adolescent movie culture, that means make him into a kind of party animal, a guy who smokes cigars and has a good time. And that's pretty much, I haven't seen the film yet, obviously, but my impression is that that's the way he's depicted. Now, that may be very successful with American audiences, particularly a certain segment of the American movie audience. But I wonder if anyone is thinking about it overseas.
Well, let me just stop you and ask you, why aren't they thinking about overseas perception? Because I was looking at the figures today, what is it, about $14.2 billion as of 2010 came in from foreign releases of American television and movies. So they've got to be cognizant of what those audiences are thinking, or are they not?
It's a question of which they were talking about. When I said no one's thinking about it, I meant Americans generally. Certainly the commentariat, you know, and people who have been weighing in on this with the notion of free speech, that everyone has a right to see this movie, and that's really all that's at stake. When you read, and you don't have to read the Sony emails and the Sony internal documents if you just talk to people in the entertainment industry, or just look at the way films are marketed, the entertainment industry thinks a lot about how to market these things overseas. And an inevitable part of that process is to think about and go back and forth about the sensibilities of various foreign audiences. One of the most critical emails that came back was somebody named Peter Taylor, who was the Sony representative in the UK, executive in the UK. And that email is fascinating because he thinks it's not funny, it's very crude, it's very offensive, and it will have trouble passing the British Board of Film Classification, which is the censorship body in Britain. Every country in the world except the US has some kind of censorship board, and the entertainment industry knows that.
So what is our image problem if we do, but you've written about this in your book, that we do have an image problem for the average person who's walking down the street anywhere from Great Britain to Indonesia? How do they think of Americans based on what we're putting out there in terms of popular culture?
There's no simple answer to that, but one way that I would sum it up would be to say that our entertainment in the recent years has become a more and more exaggerated sort of photo booth kind of caricature of our particular faults and our particular vices.
Yeah, and we're looking at some of the examples now because we think, it's only Americans who love the Kardashians, but this is a show that's gone across the globe, and they also, they see the violence that we have on television, they see the talk shows that we have on television.
And they imitate them.
They imitate them.
Yeah, sure. But we sort of, we look at it, we know it's a gross exaggeration, we either get grossed out by it, or we think it's funny, or we just kind of let it go, we don't pay any attention to it. Overseas, it's harder for people to adjust the picture and understand that that's not normal life in the United States. And there's a lot of evidence about that from, for example, international visitor programs, when people testify to the fact that America was nothing like what they expected. Some people from even countries like France are afraid to go to shopping malls in the United States for fear of getting caught in a shootout.
Because they see this in action movies and assume that's what happens. That every American is gun-toting. People
are smart. A lot of people figure it out after a while, particularly if they have some exposure to the real United States or to real Americans. But that's only a tiny percentage of the world's people. One more thing I would add in, which I think is not often discussed, is the fact that many people in the world, because their own media are state-controlled and state-owned, either indirectly or directly, they think that the U.S. government is responsible for sending them things like The Wolf of Wall Street, or Hangover, or things that in many cases distort the way other countries are also, and throw up a lot of stuff in people's faces that people in more conservative societies find very offensive. It's one thing to have the private sector do it, but a lot of people think that our government is somehow behind it.
So given that this has now been happening, as we pointed out, for decades, Charlie Chaplin did it, and I through my history, I know that Hitler was aware of that and was very offended by it. But is there any degree, obviously, but is there any degree of responsibility that Hollywood or filmmakers have to have in being aware of the image that they're creating?
Well, now you've put me in the situation of defending the sensibilities of Adolf Hitler, which I would rather not do. Nor would I like to defend the sensibilities of Kim Jong-un, but those are not, it's not the dictators themselves that are on my mind, frankly. It's the people of North Korea.
And that's what I meant as well.
When one thing about this film that bugs me is that the two main characters are quote-unquote journalists. And they get recruited by a very sexy CIA agent to become assassins for the CIA. Now, there's a lot of journalists around the world who are risking their lives to do objective, reliable news reporting in very dangerous countries and very dangerous environments. And the chief accusation that's used against them when they're harassed, when they're tormented and tortured or put in prison or killed is that they are CIA agents. Right. And who in Hollywood is thinking about that?
Well, Martha Baylis, we appreciate it. Probably the better film portrayal of journalists is Rosewater, which is, I think, still in theaters, about the real story of journalists being captured overseas. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.